Look, guys, America is decaying, and I don't even think that's a very controversial take to even have anymore. You're going to be working even harder than ever before, more than your parents or even your grandparents, and somehow getting into even more debt. Relationships nowadays feels worse to be in, both as a man and as a woman. And every election just leads to more of the same that we all come to know. We're told that these are all separate issues, but that's not how a system actually fails, which is what is happening in America in real time. They fail when the economic, cultural, and the political pieces all start breaking at once. And the evidence is everywhere, guys, if you're willing to look for it. When a society is not working, a few basics line up here. You put in effort, and the economy rewards you with basically nothing. The culture has some shared expectations, or rather, at least less now than ever before, and the political system for now represents the people living under it to some degree, though that kind of perspective is slipping further away even more. One of those can slip and the system can still limp on, but when all three aspects start breaking down at the same time, that's not a normal decline, folks. That is what we would call a structural decay happening in real time. And honestly, that's where the United States is right now. Not collapsing overnight, as many other political and social media pundits would have you believe, but slowly decaying in ways most people feel every waking day. This isn't going to be one of those average, generic panic videos or about blaming one group or even just an ideology. It's about why the American system no longer works the way it used to and why so many people feel stuck, myself included, guys, even though we are doing exactly what we were told would work for us. Now, I'm going to be breaking this down through three main areas. The first is the economy, the second is culture, and the third, well, pretty simple here, politics. And honestly, the easiest place to start is the first structural pillar, which is the economy, specifically the broken economics plaguing us all today. So, America's economic aspect, and specifically the breakdown of the post war prosperity compact that sustained the American middle class for roughly half a century. From 1945 through the early 1970s, real wages rose in tandem with productivity, manufacturing anchored employment, and the dollar's reserve status underwrote global purchasing power. A single income could support a family, buy a home by 30, and accumulate savings, which is the real definition of a functioning middle class, not just having a job. That compact quietly dissolved in the beginning of the 1980s, with offshoring, deregulation, and supply chain globalization, accelerated in the 1990s with financialization and shareholder primacy, and accumulated in the 2000s to the 2010s with the gig economy and labor atomization. Today, the United States still produces immense wealth, but it no longer distributes that wealth through wages. It distributes it through asset appreciation, capital markets, and financial instruments that are overwhelmingly benefiting existing asset holders. Now, speaking personally here, I started noticing the continued cost of living just going up. Not year by year, but month by month. And honestly, that shouldn't surprise anyone anymore. The crazy demands just to meet the basic living standards in this country are way too unrealistic. Wages are not even doable for your average American unless you're in a very specific job field. And even when people talk about housing, especially, the younger people, myself included in that generation, because I am a millennial, and the Gen Zs, what concerns me more is food and the basic goods. Yes, you can live with your parents and or roommates, sure, but you can't live without clean water and food. And inflation is making that even more problematic for us all. I've also noticed more people just living in their cars, RVs, or even vans. Smart in some ways, but you still have to pay for food, water, and gas. There's no escaping those costs anymore as well, though there are ways to reduce them, but not stop it. I just want to be clear on that in what I've been noticing as of late. And when an economy basically stops rewarding work and starts punishing survival for your average American citizen, the pressure doesn't stay just isolated, it's going to compound over time and start hollowing out the system itself. This trajectory is not unique to the United States. Britain maintained global imperial reach long after the domestic industrial strength began to decline between 1870 and 1945. The Soviet Union sustained military power throughout the stagnation phase between 1970 and 1990, even as consumer conditions deteriorated. And the late Ottoman Empire outsourced financial control to European creditors, while domestic artisans and guilds collapsed under rent-seeking middlemen. Empires often appear strong externally long after the internal economic engine that legitimizes them has begun to falter. And this is exactly why I don't buy the idea that America's economic decline is temporary at all. As I said before in one of my most popular videos that I ever posted, the job market is basically rigged against your average American. Companies pay us less. Yeah, no duh. And are replacing our workers with AI or H-1B labor, displacing most Americans who can't even compete with low-cost automation or foreign labor. And this one is also very interesting, even stifling innovations, like crippling startup businesses included in that as well. You also have corporate greed, which, no surprise there, which plays a massive role here. As inflation rates and tariffs increase the pressure here, corporations would just basically, and correctly, at least you gotta give them credit for that, respond to the changes by offshoring more jobs because, well, they realistically can. And our politicians will look the other way if, per usual, because either they get money from them or they don't care. Make that for what you will. I also want to say that the side gig economy isn't the solution either. It's clearly not sustainable, and not everyone can just up and leave their current job and just do it. For example, not everyone can be a YouTuber, not everyone can be a TikToker, or, a mainstream influencer, or even a celebrity or rapper. Good luck with all those nowadays. I generally don't see the jobs that, once made America economically powerful ever coming back. And in my opinion, that era is long gone. So when productive work disappears and is replaced by debt and instability, the damages start showing up in the numbers, even if the headlines say otherwise. On paper, GDP prints looks healthy, corporate profit breaks records, and financial media cycles the language of strong job creation and resilient markets. But the lived experience tells a different story. Home ownership is delayed into the late 30s if it arrives at all. Real wage growth is overshadowed by inflation and medical, housing, and education costs, and household debt has replaced income as a mechanism of participation. Saving rates are negative, fertility collapse alongside affordability, and family formation becomes economically irrational for large segments of the population. This gap between statistical optics and material reality is the hallmark of a late-stage imperial economics. The empire remains creditworthy abroad while its citizens struggle to remain solvent at home. I think right here is where it becomes very, very obvious to most people that the middle class is basically gone. Affordability in food, housing, and basic commodities is so unstable for the middle and lower class people. America now functions basically like a subscription service economy. Everything costs money just to even exist. Housing, phone bills, internet, healthcare, you name it. You're constantly just paying just to basically stay afloat. And it's not just, inside of America either, if you ask me. This model extends outward to even our own allies and even our own trading partners across the globe. In the end, everyone pays, one way or another. That's why the middle class is almost gone here in America, and it's only going to get worse for those who can't even afford to live in this once great country. Now, here's the part people usually miss. When an economy stops working for the ordinary people, it doesn't just create financial stress, it starts reshaping how people behave and relate to each other. And that brings us to the second pillar of America's decline, the culture. America's decline in the cultural aspect, specifically the breakdown of shared ideological, social, and normative frameworks that once anchored social cohesion. Over the last 2 decades, the United States has undergone accelerated cultural sorting in which men and women, urban and rural populations, and professional and non-professional classes increasingly inhibit separate informational ecosystems, moral vocabularies, and visions of the country's future. The survey data consistently shows men drifting towards more nationalistic, populist, or even post liberal perspectives, while women tend to trend towards more progressive, cosmopolitan, or even more social democratic ideologies. This divergence is reinforced by the media segmentation, academic institutions, and workplace incentives, producing not just disagreement, but incompatible social worldviews. Now, speaking from my perspective, I don't think any of this should be surprising at all. If you ask me, men in America, and in Western Europe for that matter, are either becoming more right leaning or already drifting even further to the right. Every day, the media, society, and the broader culture keeps telling us men that we are the problem and that masculinity itself is defective and problematic in this day and age. At some point, you start to see why men are now turning to the side that tells them to basically man up, take responsibility, and follow the traditions of your forefathers. On the flip side, women in modern American society are told that freedom is the end all be all, and that equality means outcomes rather than opportunity, and that emotions should guide our decision making process. To basically make this simple for you all, men want stability through tradition, country, and masculinity, while women are encouraged towards openness, equality without limits, and emotional primacy. At that point, it stops becoming an abstract cultural issue and starts affecting how men and women actually try to build relationships and even families. This cultural sorting directly intersects with the collapse of the dating market and the erosion of the family formation incentives. Historically, stable societies depended on aligned expectations between men and women, economic security, and social norms that rewarded long-term commitment. In modern America, those mechanisms have decoupled. Men and women now hold fundamentally different expectations for relationships, making risk calculations for marriage and different valuations of family as an institution. As a result, marriage is delayed or even outright avoided. Fertility rates have fallen below replacement levels, and the family formation has become economically and socially irrational for a large segment of the population. And this is where I'm going to be very, very blunt to you all. The dating market in America is so broken that it would actually take God Himself appearing in front of us and snapping His fingers just to fix it. There's no going back to the 1950s model. And no, you're not going to see women becoming loyal or even traditional again for a very, very long time. Because from their perspective, why should they? That's the double standard. Us men are told we need to be men by asking women for accountability and responsibility and to even preserve their own femininity. In return, is treated as an offense to them. Where exactly is the equality in that? I mean, guys, please remind me. But it is what it is, unfortunately. I also want to say another thing here. What I see isn't just having a disagreement anymore. It's pure incompatibility with both the left and the right. We've been in a culture war for over a decade or more so now, and I don't think anyone is denying that fact anymore. If you ask me who's winning it, it's the left. Not because I like their arguments or that their arguments are even better. No, but because they control most of the institutions, funding, and the social media apparatus, like platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, just to name a few. They largely hold women as the main demographic, while the right increasingly consolidates men in the real world. What we're living through looks less like pluralism and more like a cold cultural civil war that seems to be growing worse every day, but still remains cold. Interesting, isn't it? That kind of breakdown will not stay contained at a personal level. It spreads outward into spaces of ideology, speech, and social trust. The broader consequence of this cultural fracture is ideological fragmentation and the erosion of shared speech norms. The United States no longer possesses a unified cultural narrative, but instead contains parallel ideological tribes that disagree not only about policy, but about reality, moral legitimacy, and what the country is for. As polarization intensifies, free speech norms deteriorate through a hybridized system of control, top-down institutional pressure from the governments, platforms, employers, and universities, combined with bottom up social punishment through cancellation, reputational attacks, and expanding taboos. The result is widespread self censorship, collapsing social trust, and an inability to resolve conflict through open debates, a pattern historically observed in late Republic and late Imperial societies. I'm sure you guys can tell how we all feel about what I just said about the specific cultural issues, because on the online space, the right has been obviously and clearly disproportionately restricted, demonetized, or even just outright banned for no reasons at all. Though the same tools are now starting to hit the left as well, unironically, but for different reasons. And in real life, it's only getting worse, guys, because anonymity disappears and people are basically fearing that they're going to be losing their jobs, relationships, or even their own reputations. There are entire topics today that can basically get you fired, banned, or even socially ostracized by just basically questioning the political ideologies, cultural narratives, or even the government itself. These topics are considered dangerous precisely because they threaten the current political and social order, and the result is collapsing trust and constant self censorship. No surprise there, which goes exactly against what the founding fathers had envisioned for the freedom of speech concept in terms of having different opinion and debating one another. But I digress. You know, it's also hard not to see the historical parallels here, to be honest. The Weimar Republic ignored their own cultural decay until the consequences became so unavoidable and led to the rise of a certain dictator that we all know of. And the Western Roman Empire followed a similar path of fragmentation and institutional rot. And right now, America is showing the exact same warning signs. So here's the bottom line. I am just going to say it. To the people outside of this country, I know America still looks glamorous through Instagram and by what other mainstream media apps and or TVs are showing you, but for those who are actually living here, it feels very different. More like a managed decline, and in some areas, closer to third world conditions than the image we like to sell to the world. That's just the honest picture, guys. And I'm forewarning you if you ever decide to go to America to achieve or even live the American dream. It's not going to happen 9 times out of 10. Not saying it can't, but your chances are very slim as it stands. And when a society becomes this fractured, when people don't share similar values, reality, or even speech norms, the political system built on representation stops functioning completely. Which brings us to the third and final pillar of America's decline: politics. In theory, the American political system was designed to aggregate domestic interests and translate them into policy. In practice, it has reorientated itself towards serving financial, bureaucratic, and geopolitical interests instead of its own citizens. Over the last several decades, Congress has ceded policymaking authority to executive agencies, regulatory bureaucracies, and private sector lobbies. Political parties have transformed into fundraising machines rather than representative institutions, and elections have increasingly become media spectacles rather than the mechanisms of accountability. The result is a political class that governs but does not meaningfully represent its own citizens. Now, from my point of view regarding what I just said to you guys, America is one of the biggest countries with some of the deepest political corruption on the planet. I think we can all agree with the recent files showing what our political elite are doing behind closed doors now being released to the public. You can see just how deep that corruption really goes. What the content within those files clearly shows us is that they don't care at all about the public or the average citizen. When it comes to justice, there is none, at least not for the people that basically rule over us. Our politicians serve those who actually hold power: people with money, information, blackmail leverage, foreign interests, and of course, the easy one, themselves, not you. And honestly, I started noticing this when I was back in high school, that it was not just a few bad actors, but that it was a systematic problem and that most state actors are basically a part of it. With that all being said, at that stage, representation doesn't just fail, it reshapes how information itself is controlled and presented to the public. This political dislocation is sustained by narrative infrastructure. Our media no longer functions as a neutral information intermediary, but instead operates as an ecosystem system that selectively frames, filters, or suppresses narratives to preserve existing power alignments. Rather than reporting reality, the media institutions shape the perception, often in coordination with the political and the financial elites, producing a population that is informed yet misled, aware that something is wrong, but unclear about why it is happening and who benefits from it. I want to say something in regarding to what was just said and be clear on this. The mainstream media in America is very notorious for pushing what I would call about 95% misinformation or disinformation, or maybe a mix of both, just to fit the narrative they want you to see and hear. The way to do it is very simple. They sprinkle in a little bit of truth here, a clip here, an image there, and bring on a carefully selected guest. And then all at once, just bury you inside a mountain of lies. That's how propaganda works, ladies and gentlemen, and America's no exception. And mark my words, this isn't accidental at all. The media itself is structurally designed to dissuade its own citizens from thinking for themselves by holding our politicians accountable or even taking meaningful actions peacefully and legally, of course. You can see the effects very clearly when the military intervenes far away and is framed as a noble and necessary cause, while anyone paying close attention knows that they don't serve the American people at all. They serve the politicians and the lobbyists, not us. Now, this kind of narrative management has actual real life consequences, because when perception is engineered at this level, domestic collapse can happen quietly while attention is redirected everywhere else. Once perception is managed this aggressively, it becomes easier for the political class to ignore conditions at home without facing any resistance. At the domestic level, American political leadership increasingly abandons homefront issues in favor of international projects, donor class priorities, and ideological initiatives. Infrastructure, manufacturing, wages, family formation, housing affordability, and public services deteriorate, while significant resources are redirected abroad. Citizens experience this as a political neglect, a form of an abandonment which the government governs but does not protect, extracts but does not invest, commands loyalty but does not reciprocate it. So clearly, this is where a lot of Americans, including myself, are just basically fed up with. Our politicians are ignoring our healthcare needs, safety, freedoms, and economic stability, things that actually affect us every single day. You would think that voting and having the democratic system would mean our representatives actually living up to the slogans, but they really don't. No surprise there. Instead, people are feeling angry, frustrated, and eventually becoming very apathetic to all of this, if not already. And I don't blame them, honestly. No matter what we say or even do, our politicians are continuously focusing on foreign countries that have absolutely no real correlation to our daily lives, as we're currently seeing. We're told it's about our allies, global peace, and or shared liberal values. But that narrative doesn't really work anymore. The signal they have been pushing towards the average American is very simple. Your value in this system is pure meaningless. This is where demoralization sets in, and basically people start believing real political change is impossible, which, to be fair, unfortunately feels true right now, and some would argue is true. Me personally, 100% absolutely true. I'm not denying that. At that point, foreign policy stops being about national interest and starts looking like imperial maintenance that benefits no one but our politicians. Externally, the United States has pursued a series of geopolitical interventions, proxy wars, and foreign policy adventures that deliver little strategic or even material benefits to its own citizens. From Iraq and Afghanistan to Libya, Syria, Ukraine, and now even Iran, the American foreign policy increasingly resembles imperial maintenance rather than national interests. These interventions are rhetorically justified through democracy, security, or even humanitarian language, but in practice, they weaken domestic legitimacy and burden the state financially, militarily, and diplomatically. So America's foreign policy adventures need to realistically come to an end. in my opinion. And I'm also not the one saying this. I've seen a plethora of YouTubers say the exact same thing, and a plethora of my friends who think the same and also have said the same. That way, we can actually refocus all of that money and, willpower back home because let's be honest, we desperately need to do so. People, myself included, are clearly fed up with the endless economic and military aid going to countries that provide no real value to the average American citizen. The beneficiaries are very obvious, and they are the military industrial complex, lobbyists, and investors, whether it be foreign or domestic. Money and agendas carry more weight than us, the voters. And if you ask your neighbor, 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you they don't want more foreign wars. But again, that's not up to us. And that right there is the problem. This constant outward expansion comes at a cost because a state that prioritizes empire over its own people eventually loses the moral authority to govern. So over time, this pattern erodes America's standing and legitimacy on the global stage. The dollar-based financial order faces alternatives. Sanctions fatigue weakens compliance, and non-Western states seek autonomy from the US-led institutions. The United States retains immense power, but power without legitimacy becomes increasingly costly to sustain. Historically, empires enter a decline state not when they run out of power, but when they run out of legitimacy. A pattern seen in the late Roman Empire, the late British Empire, and the Soviet Union. The perception gap becomes the final diagnostic marker. Officially, America presents itself as the world's indispensable nation, defender of democracy, and engine of global stability. In the lived reality, citizens observe a political class that represents foreign interests, corporations, bureaucracies, or ideological projects, but not them. So, what we can take away from this is America isn't technically losing its ability to project its power, but it's losing its image. There's a clear distinction between the two. In many ways, it reminds me of the final years of the Soviet Union. Other countries are stepping into spaces America once dominated, like China, for example. It's just one of many that has the potential to do so. Not to mention, on top of that, competing economic and political blocs like BRICS are forming as an alternative to the US dollar and the euro, which is what the world actually needs right now. The long-term consequences is simple: less investment, less upward mobility, and a collapsing version of the American dream. This is why America should cut its losses abroad and refocus back home. Because if it doesn't, someone else will outdo the empire better. And right now, that someone is China. And you know something here? Our politicians should take this very seriously. The Western Roman Empire collapsed through internal neglect, and the Soviet Union rotted from within while pretending everything was all fine and dandy. America hasn't been winning any wars lately, if you haven't noticed. And if our politicians keep starting more of them, they're only accelerating the collapse of this once great country. Now, from your American citizens' point of view, this image that we present to the world isn't working anymore. People aren't happy and they don't believe the story that they're being sold. Liberty and freedom are obviously being marketed consistently, but most Americans feel very apathetic towards that image because, if I'm being honest with you guys, it doesn't match the reality that we're actually living in. You have the media and the political elites who keep pushing a very stupid narrative upon everyone, which we all know isn't true, while the politicians enrich themselves chasing agendas that don't even exist for the people anymore. With all that being said, America's decaying state shouldn't surprise anyone at this point. This is a civilizational, or if you really want to call it what it is, an imperial decline process. It's ironic because people always talk about how empires tend to last around 250 years. And honestly, that statement looks more true than I ever wanted it to be. I don't see the economy or the job market getting better anytime soon. In fact, I think the older generations, along with the political and the corporate elites, sold out the younger generations for their own greed. Now, the younger generations are walking into a world with fewer jobs, less stability, and less meaning in the so-called American dream that has unfortunately turned into something closer to a nightmare. So guys, I'm telling you, don't hope for a miracle. seriously. Prepare for the worst and plan ahead. Start your own business if you can, especially now with AI tools everywhere to help you. Network relentlessly or move somewhere else that gives you a better shot at a real life. I'm also not going to drag this out with the culture war theatrics. The left already won the war a long time ago. And no, there's not going to be a civil war or some grand revolution. Don't expect one. And I've made 2 videos basically covering those topics. And if we're being honest, starting a family in America right now is, how would you put it politely, as the younger kids call it, cooked. The legal system, cultural norms, and incentives are stacked in ways that make it terrible for most men today, in terms of it being a terrible deal. That's also why free speech is eroding into something the founding fathers wouldn't even recognize if they were brought from the past to today. As for the politicians themselves, don't bother. Yes, there are a few decent ones, but they're rare. Voting in America feels increasingly null and void, and most politicians don't care about the average American voter. What they do care about is foreign wars, money, and their own power. We have seen this clearly, especially right now in 2026, and sadly, it's going to continue beyond this year as well. So yeah, America is decaying as an empire, as a state, and as a people. Not much else to say. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm out.